How Vikings changed the English language. The Vikings had a large influence on the English language and were key in the transition from Old English to Middle English. The Old English spoken by the Anglo-Saxons in Britain and the Old Norse spoken by the Vikings were similar enough to allow for communication between the two groups, yet different enough that Vikings raiding and eventually settling in Britain brought drastic changes to the grammar and vocabulary of English. But who were the Vikings, and what was the long-term impact of their changes to the English language? The Vikings were Scandinavian traders and colonists who frequently turned to piracy and raiding. The word Viking means one who lurks in a bay. The Vikings who raided Britain and the British Isles came specifically from Norway and Denmark. The Vikings spoke a language that we call Old Norse. It was a North Germanic language, and probably similar to Old English. It is likely that the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons in England could understand each other. There are several reasons that explain why the Vikings raided and plundered in Britain and Europe. The first of these is that around the time that the Vikings first began their invasions, the Frankish Empire was in decline, which invited raids by outside invaders. Another factor may be that overspending by Arab caliphs had caused Vikings to abandon trade in the Baltic Seas and led them to seek more violent means of accumulating wealth. The promise of treasures, as well as the need for land, may have also led to the Viking raids. There was little fertile land in western Norway, and in Scotland, the Vikings could farm and trade, as well as plunder and raid. Changes in climate also made it easy for the Vikings to travel to the British Isles and back. In the 9th and 10th centuries, the seas began to calm, and the number of summer storms decreased. In addition, the predominant winds blew westward in the spring, which would take the Vikings to the British Isles, and eastward in the autumn, which would carry their boats back to Scandinavia. Climate also led to population growth, which led to the onset of raids. The improving climate of this time, which allowed more children to survive to adulthood, as well as the Viking practices of polygamy, having multiple wives, and primogeniture, leaving one's entire inheritance to the eldest son, led to an increased number of younger sons looking for fortune and adventure. At first, the Vikings would come to the British Isles to raid and plunder during the summer, and then return to Scandinavia for the winter. Over time, they began to establish winter camps so that they could stay in Britain year-round. These winter bases evolved into permanent settlements. In 878 CE, the Anglo-Saxon king, King Alfred, agreed to a truce with Guthrum, the Viking king. Guthrum was baptized, and England was divided into the southern Anglo-Saxon kingdom and the northern Danelaw by an imaginary line running from London to Bedford. In communities where the Vikings and Anglo-Saxons lived together, the relationship between the two peoples was hostile at first. The Vikings were violent, taking what they wanted by force, and through their farming, they were taking away land from the native people. Over time, though, the two groups gradually began to live peacefully alongside each other. One way of seeing the impact, influence, and distribution of the Scandinavians in an area is through place names. Many places were named for people or geographical and topographical features, so it was easy to see where there's a Scandinavian influence. One example of this is the English farming village of Skeffington. Skeft is an English name, and the suffix ton comes from Old English, but the sk sound at the beginning is a common beginning sound in Old Norse. It's possible that Skeffington was an English farming village that was then taken over by Vikings. Other suffixes that indicate Scandinavian settlement or influence are by, thwaite, and thorp. Another way that place names can be used to learn about Viking and Anglo-Saxon interactions is by looking at the original meaning of the place names. This can show what the Vikings thought of the people and landscape that they encountered in a particular place. For example, the name Lerwick means mud bay, and could have shown the Vikings' scorn of a place that they considered to be useless. Though many places were influenced by the Vikings, settlements developed differently based on the context in which the Vikings came and lived. Some places, such as Dublin and Waterford in Ireland, became more urban, while settlements in Scotland tended to be more rural. There were already towns in England, but in general, when the Vikings came, they further developed these towns. Because Old English and Old Norse had a common Germanic base, they were compatible with each other, and elements of Old Norse were easily incorporated into Old English. English changed as the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings began to interact more in everyday life. Many of the words that became integrated into English from Old Norse are words that have to do with everyday tasks, because they were added gradually through interactions such as farming, trade, and eventually intermarriage and the assimilation of Vikings into Anglo-Saxon communities. This led to the development of Middle English.
The Vikings had a rather important influence on the English vocabulary, since a significant portion of the words we use today have roots that can be found in the Viking language. Even the word root comes from Old Norse, which is the language that the Vikings spoke. They started to influence the language around 800 CE, and kept going over time. The big influence didn't happen until around 1200, about 100 years after the Norman conquest of England. It then continued to heavily influence English vocabulary for the next couple of centuries until the influence died down. Old Norse was actually one of the earlier influences in English vocabulary that came from the Indo-European area. They brought over a lot of synonyms for the words that the Anglo-Saxons had already had words for. For example, they brought the word skill while there was already the word craft. Some of the words are things that we don't use today often, like nay, which was brought over when they already had the word no, which we use a lot more nowadays. Some of the words they brought over were really close to their modern equivalent, like hend, which is now hand, while some were really far away, like sturt, which means leaped. Some of the words were also closely related, like they, them, and their. A decent amount of the words that came from Old Norse seem to have th or sk at the beginning too. Quite a few of the words seem to be words that are used fairly commonly in conversation today, like anger or get, compared to the more elegant words that are rarely used nowadays, like exasperation. Some of the words that came from Old Norse seem to be even more common than the words that we got from the Anglo-Saxons, in general at least. Some words, however, are not really used at all, or aren't first choice compared to their Anglo-Saxon synonyms. For example, the word fro instead of from. The vocabulary the Vikings used was highly influential, nevertheless.
The Middle English language was much more simple than Old English. It lost gender and it simplified its verbs. One theory is that this came from the Normans. However, they weren't able to affect how common people talked for several reasons. For one, they were just such a small percentage of the population, around 10,000 Normans to 1.2 million English common people, along with the fact that very few common people would ever hear a Norman talk. They likely wouldn't copy them if they spoke English differently. This wouldn't change if it was your king. If you heard Obama speaking like Yoda, would you go home and speak like Yoda for the rest of your life? There was approximately the same chance a peasant would do that if they heard their king speak. If you actually were odd enough to do that, what are the chances that whole villages would do the same thing also? Norman children were also learning English during their early childhood and needing to be formally taught French. It was accepted that the Normans added a lot of vocabulary, but didn't really change the grammar. The reason the Vikings affected grammar was that they had to speak with the natives once they settled there. They would have had a lot of trouble with learning the language because adults don't learn language very well. Also, in the parts of England where the Vikings settled, there were a very high percentage of the population. This meant that the English that small children were learning was the incomplete English that was spoken by Vikings. They were learning the version that probably didn't include genders and all of the complicated stuff that wouldn't have been easy to explain to a foreigner. The places where you can see this change are the places that had a higher percent of Vikings, namely the north. Here are the conjugational endings for Northumbrian, Old English, and Southern Middle English. For future reference, the symbol at the end of he and she in Old English sounds like the th in thin. In Northumbrian, the conjugational verb endings disappeared much sooner than they did in the Psalms.
One very large influence the Vikings had on the English language was the overall simplification of the language. Some good examples of this simplification are seen in the transition from Old English to Middle English. A few of the most noticeable changes in this transition include the changes to verb conjugations, the loss of gender articles, and the disappearance of some words altogether. But first, let's take a look at some verb conjugations. In this chart, we first compare the conjugational endings for the present tense Old English to Northern Middle English. One of the first things that can be seen in this chart is the vast difference between the two versions of the language. Apart from the conjugation of I, which has the ending of e, stay, all the other conjugations change. For both the conjugations of you and he/she, Northern Middle English simplifies the conjugation to a mere es instead of est and eth. And to make matters even simpler for the language, the conjugations for we, you all, and they changed to just a plain E from the ending of ath ending. Although this change could be explained just by time and people's laziness speaking the language, take a look at this chart comparing the two different dialects of Middle English. One of these dialects is the Northern Middle English, while the other dialect is a Southern dialect of Middle English. Once again, the conjugation for I stays the same, but oddly, every other conjugation is different, even though both dialects are Middle English. In addition, the Southern Middle English keeps the th or th sound, while the Northern Middle English drops the sound. Again, this may seem incredibly odd to have two dialects of Middle English that vary so much, but even this can be explained. As mentioned many times before, the Vikings did have a very large influence on the English language, and the Vikings mainly settled in the northern part of Britain. One way the Vikings have changed the dialect in this way is from how you speak words. If you did not notice, when the conjugated ending changed to become simpler, the vowel changed from an A to an E. A logical reason this happens is because of the tongue placement when speaking vowels. This diagram shows the placement of the tongue in the mouth when sounding out vowels. When you try to make an A sound at the end of the word, your tongue will slowly move forward from the back of your mouth and will eventually make an E sound. This gives another reason as to why the northern dialect got simpler as compared to the southern dialect, which developed from Old English alone, instead of having a Viking influence. While this is a fairly significant change in itself, the Vikings still simplified English in other ways. Another significant change the Vikings had on the English language was the loss of gender articles on words. This may sound confusing, but all it means is there is a short article before a word that determines whether a word is masculine, feminine, or genderless. This may seem odd to us as English speakers, but gender articles exist in every other Indo-European language but English, making the language we speak the odd one out, and not the other way around. What ended up happening to English was that all of the articles that used to determine the gender of a word was simplified to only using the word the. For example, German, which is a Germanic language along with English, still has articles. These articles are der, which denotes a masculine word, die, which denotes a feminine word, or das, which denotes a genderless word. When translating to English, we would substitute der, die, and das for the. Here are some examples of this. In German, der Mann translates to the man. Similarly, die Frau translates to the woman, and das Kind translates to the child. As you see, all of the translations from a language that has gender articles to English removed the gender article and replaced it with the all-catching the. In relation to how gender articles in English were replaced, there are a few words that were nearly removed from English altogether. A few words that were erased from the modern English language are hither, thither, and whither. These words were the directional forms of here, there, and where. What this means is that hither meant to move to this place, thither meant to move to that place, and whither meant to what place. If it was not obvious, these words are never used anymore and are considered archaic. Nowadays, we replace these words with the phrases come here, go there, and to where instead. Once again, the English is the odd one out here because other Germanic languages still have words like this. For instance, we'll use German as an example again. The word hier means here, but to ask someone to come to you, use the phrase komm her. Notice that you do not say komm hier, but you say komm her. Likewise, with her being the German equivalent of hither, hin is the German equivalent of thither, and wohin is the German equivalent of whither. The Vikings helped change this change along with the addition of many other grammatical changes. In general, the Vikings influenced many major grammatical changes in the English.
The Vikings brought a lot more to England than raiding and pillaging. They helped bring English to what it is today. They are the reason that we no longer have to deal with the genders of nouns and conjugate verb endings. They made it into a lingua franca that adults could learn with work. This is part of why English has become so common as a second language.